if it's not already clear, my focus tonight is to talk about the Spartans, and I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that most people, when they encounter the Spartans, encounter them via some format involving the Battle of Thermopylae. In some ways, I would say that the famous last stand of Leonidas at Thermopylae is synonymous with Sparta. And you can sort of see that in the nice obvious popular culture reference I have on the screen here for you. I don't know why I'm pointing at that screen. I should be pointing at that screen because there's screens at the back where I can see what I'm talking about as well. The older generation might have encountered the Battle of Thermopylae in the 1962 film The 300 Spartans. They might have encountered it in William Golding's 1965 collection of essays entitled The Hot Gates. They might have encountered it in a variety of different ways. You might have encountered the Spartans as I did at high school when I was 12 years old, and I've been interested in working on them ever since. But the odd thing about it is Leonidas and his 300, or the remnant of the 300 who fought and died on the last day at Thermopylae, would never have realised or expected that any of their actions would have actually led to us talking about the Spartans today. According to Herodotus, when Leonidas and his men realised that they had been surrounded and that they would die if they remained on the field of battle, they remained there not out of any great desire to generate fame, not so that they would have a spectacular death, but because they deemed it would be unseemly not to remain at their post. It was unseemly because the Spartan way to do things was to remain at your post no matter what. And that's something that becomes very clear in Simonides' famous epigram written for the Spartans after the event, which you can see a modern version of at the site of the Battle of Thermopylae today. And the translation of it is, "O stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their words." This is often translated as obedient to their laws, but literally it just says the things that they have said. So they died at Thermopylae because of their obedience to what Spartans told them to do. So the much heralded obedience is what I want to focus on tonight. But to put things into perspective quickly for those of you who are not entirely familiar with the Spartans, I've got a few slides to sort of put things, tell a little bit of story so that we can get some background in before we get on to the much bigger, meatier issues. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Spartans, they can be found in the town of Sparta here. They were relative incomers into the Greek world, migrants from somewhere north of Greece, entered into that area in the 9th or 8th centuries BC, quickly conquered the surrounding territory, somewhat enslaved some of the local inhabitants. Having made a success of that, they crossed the mountains and conquered their neighbouring people next door, the Messenians. The conquest and enslavement of those people enabled them to devote themselves to a warrior lifestyle, the warrior lifestyle that we then see in action at the Battle of Thermopylae. It allowed them to call themselves a society of equals. The term they used for themselves was the homoioi, which we translate sometimes as peers, sometimes as equals, sometimes as similars. The other term for citizens is the Spartiatai. They emphasised their equality by having the same appearance. They had their hair long, they wore red cloaks. In the early phase of what I'm talking about today, they had long red cloaks. Later on, they had shorter red cloaks. But they dressed the same, they looked the same. They pretended that they were equal in terms of wealth, but it's very much a pretense. There were much wealthier Spartans, but the wealth was masked. As Anton Powell puts it, the Spartans were very good at lying, not just to outsiders, but to themselves as well, about how their society actually worked. I've got some other nice images of Spartans to put things in perspective as well, so we can get away from the popular image of the Spartans in the film 300 and things like that. I have a nice vase painting which is probably meant to relate to the Persian Wars. You have a very long-haired Spartan there, fighting stark naked. There is no evidence that Spartans fought stark naked, but there are lots of vase paintings showing this. And this is clearly a popular image. There's a classical period scaraboid showing what is obviously a Spartan fighting against a Persian here. And the sort of, despite what you think the Spartans might look like from the film 300 with the big Corinthian-style helmet that covers their face, they're much more likely to have a helmet like this one here, which is sort of like a London Bobby's helmet, rather than what you see in films. So to take things back to the Battle of Thermopylae, take things back to obedience, I start with passage 1 on your epic handout, if you've got your handouts, and I think Michael's missed out on one. So unfortunately, I need the one I have because I'm going to return to it frequently. Prior to the battle at Thermopylae, Xerxes, the Persian king, sent spies to see what the Greeks were doing, because he realised that Greeks were trying to stop him at the narrow pass at Thermopylae. And he was slightly baffled by this because, according to Herodotus, he had millions of men. He would have had hundreds of thousands of men, or maybe 150,000 men, and there were only 4,000 Greeks trying to stop him. When he learned from the spy that the Spartans were exercising naked and combing their hair, he was slightly baffled by this. So he summoned one of his entourage, a man by the name of Demaratus, who was an exiled Spartan king. He said, "What are these weird people doing?" And Demaratus explained that that's what Spartans do when they're preparing themselves to die. Xerxes couldn't understand this because he couldn't understand why so few men would actually fight against his massive army. And Demaratus went on to explain to him that it's because of their obedience. He says that the Spartans are the bravest soldiers, and fighting together they are the best on earth. And he goes on to say that this is because they are free, yet not wholly free, because law, nomos is the Greek word here, is their master, whom they fear much more than your men fear you. They do whatever it bids, and its bidding is always the same, that they must never flee from the battle before any multitude of men, but must abide by their post and there conquer or die. So the Spartans are going to fight against Xerxes because of their resolute, not just obedience to the law, but their fear of the law that makes them what you might want to think of as super obedient. We then get a series of images of resolute Spartans from Herodotus as well that put that in perspective. And I've got an image of arrowheads from the battlefield at Thermopylae to put this in perspective for you. Herodotus tells us that when someone tried to scare the Spartans and tell them that there were so many Persian archers that their arrows would make the sky go dark, one of the Spartans responded, "Well, that's a good thing, we'll fight in the shade." And perhaps the most iconic response of the Spartans doesn't come from Herodotus, it comes from a much later source, is the claim that Leonidas, when Xerxes demanded the Spartans hand over their arms, responded in 2 words, "Come and take them." It's an image that has left its mark on our society today, and there's a wonderful, I say wonderful, poster from the NRA to put that in perspective there, the way they have taken on this image of the resolute response of the Spartans to the claim to ask them to surrender their arms. So what we have here is a series of images of bravery being equated with obedience at Sparta, and they're not isolated episodes. There are frequent references to Spartan obedience in our sources, and I've got a few of them in your epic handout here. So you have in number 2, you have from Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, you have the Spartan king Archidamus talking to his fellow citizens about why they are going to win against the Athenians, and he says they need to think about how powerful the Athenians are, but remember that they are going to win because they follow where they will be where they will be led. They regard discipline and vigilance as of first importance, and to obey with alacrity the orders transmitted to each other. He said, this is what is going to make us defeat the Athenians. In passage 3, he has another attempt to inspire the Spartans to fight against the Athenians, making it clear again that obedience to the law is the most important part of their method in terms of approaching warfare. He says, we are warlike because self-control contains honour as a chief constituent, and we honour bravery. We are wise because we are educated too little with too little learning to despise the laws, and with too severe a self-control to disobey them. He goes on to say that they will be prepared for any eventuality that comes against them, and this is what separates them from everyone else. Their superiority lies with them being reared in the severest school. In passage 4, you have Plutarch highlighting Spartan obedience again. He says, if any Spartan was summoned to see the Spartan officials, the ephors, he did not walk slowly in obeying the summons, but by running eagerly at full speed through the marketplace, they exhibited to their fellow citizens their spirit of obedience, rejoicing in paying homage to their rulers. And probably my favourite one of these passages here, number 5, is the Spartan general Brasidas speaking to his second in command. He tells him to show himself a brave man as a Spartan should, and then goes on to talk to the allies and says, follow him, and remember that zeal, honour and obedience mark the good soldier, and this day will make you either free men or slaves of the Athenians, and he will go on to show that he can practice what he preaches as well. So he makes it very clear that obedience is the important factor here. You have one other example of obedience that I want to talk about, and I've got a modern artwork to put this in perspective. In the middle of the 6th century, there's a battle which is known to us as the Battle of the Champions, which makes it sound like some sort of game show. The Spartans disputed a territory, adjacent territory, with their neighbouring enemies, the Argives. The two city-states decided, rather than have a major pitched battle, they would pick 300 champions who would fight to the death to decide who got to keep the disputed territory. At the end of the battle, 2 Argives survived, and they promptly went back to their army to tell the Argives that they had won. There was one surviving Spartan by the name of Orthia. He decided to stay on the field of battle. He stripped the corpses of the Argives of their armour, set up a battlefield trophy, and the Spartans then were able to argue that they had in fact won. They ended up having a major battle afterwards in which there were huge numbers of casualties. The Spartans won, they kept the disputed territory, and Orthia then committed suicide because he thought that it was shameful that he had survived when all of his fellow champions had died. It gets turned into a wonderful example of Spartan sort of over-the-top behaviour later on. Plutarch describes Orthia having written an inscription or a message about the victory in the Battle of Champions in his own blood as he committed suicide. So you've got this message very strongly that this is the kind of things that Spartans do. And I've got one more negative example to bring up before I get into the bigger issues as well. And that's the fate of the survivor of the Battle of Thermopylae, a man by the name of Aristodemus, who survived the battle because he had what Herodotus calls an affliction of the eye. He came home rather than fight to the death. When he got back, he was derided as a coward. The Spartans had a word for coward, which is a trembler. He was known as Aristodemus the Trembler, and he was shunned by everyone, and ultimately he would go on to commit suicide at the subsequent Battle of Plataea in spectacular style, but the Spartans were not impressed by his show of bravery as the rest of the Greeks saw it. Their response was, well, he wanted to die, so it wasn't brave at all. So these are some sort of stereotypes about the Spartans. And when you go back and look at secondary scholarship, particularly things written in the early part of the 20th century, all of these stories about the Spartans tended to be accepted at face value. And Spartan society was seen as a society that decided one day to turn itself into a brutal militaristic regime. And I have an image from Larry Gonick's cartoon History of the Universe to put this in perspective here, where you have a Spartan ploughing the field and says, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I want someone else to do it. And that this is the idea that the Spartans then decided that they would just conquer the Messenians and turn themselves into this militarized society. And it's something that the other Greeks believed happened as well. And Thucydides, who probably ought to have known better, in the early part of his History of the Peloponnesian War, describes Sparta as having had the same constitution for more than 400 years. And that is clearly not the case, but this is the message the Spartans managed to produce that the rest of the Greeks understood, and they themselves probably swallowed a little bit as well. So the Spartans are often seen as a society that sort of destroyed themselves, or have often been seen that way, as a society that destroyed themselves by trying to retain control of Messenia and the Helots who they conquered. And people will pay a lot of attention to Thucydides' wonderful statement that most Spartan institutions had been designed with a view to security against the Helots. So the Spartans have been compared to sort of the legend of Fafnir, who turned himself into a dragon to protect the gold that he had and then couldn't enjoy it. So the Spartans are seen in the same way. They've conquered this territory, they now have a life of freedom, except they then have to spend all their time becoming professional soldiers who will be brave and obedient and fight to the death. So you also have some other stereotypes coming out, and this is bringing in Tyrtaeus here nicely for you here. The idea that the Helots are a simmering mass of resentment who will be able to rise up against the Spartans whenever they like. And in one of the surviving fragments of Tyrtaeus' poetry, they're described as like donkeys exhausted under great loads, who are forced to bring the masters half of the fruits of their land. And I have an image of a donkey from an animal welfare site to put that in perspective for you, that this is not a happy lifestyle for the Helots. But Sparta isn't quite what the stereotypes would tell you. And since the 1980s, there has been a surge of work on Sparta, and I have the covers of some volumes here to put that in perspective, and we heard the talk of it from about 15 years ago. This is not working properly. We have Michael's book on Sparta there in all its glory, alongside a host of volumes dedicated totally to Sparta. There's been, I think it's not unfair to say, an explosion of work on Sparta. Increasingly, this work has been looking at challenging and debating all the preconceptions we have about the Spartans. Pretty much everything about Sparta has been challenged. An example of that is the nature of the relationship between the Spartans and their Helots. It was frequently or normally seen as very much a class struggle. The oppressed Helots ready to rise up against the Spartans at any point in time. People have started to look at things in another way and think, well, maybe the relationship between the Spartans and the Helots is a lot more symbiotic. The idea that the Spartans are a militarized society has been questioned, and the notion that the Spartans are exceptional is something that has been debated as well, and that will continue to be debated and explored in the forthcoming Blackwell Companion to Sparta as well, which is coming out later in the year. And one of the things that's happened as people have started to reappraise Sparta and what the Spartans are like is the image of Spartan obedience has come under attack as well. Relatively recently, John Hesk and Ellen Millender, amongst others, have highlighted the fact that the image of Spartan obedience is coming out very strongly in Athenian sources. So a lot of those quotations I gave you earlier are sources that are written by Athenians or have a very strong connection with the Athenians. So what people have started to do is say this image of Spartan obedience is a negative stereotype, and it's the Athenians telling you a negative thing about the Spartans. So one of the things that you can focus on here is the Athenians cast themselves as naturally brave, whereas the Spartans have to have bravery beaten into them. Another thing that people focus on is the fact that one of the key messages about Spartan obedience comes from Demaratus, who is a rather ambiguous character. He's exiled from Sparta. He is a traitor to the Greek cause. He can be viewed as a collaborator. So if a collaborator is telling you this message about the Spartans, does this dilute his message? That's one way of looking at it. I would argue, and will be arguing soon, that perhaps the fact that he's such an ambivalent character, ambiguous character, might highlight the message that he's giving you, so that even someone as flawed as Demaratus can see how Spartans are meant to behave. The other thing to think about in this question also is negative stereotypes. They are not by default untrue, and they are not by default viewed as negative by the people who are being described in a negative kind of way. So just because the Athenians thought Spartan obedience was a bad thing doesn't mean Spartans thought that obedience was a bad thing. And there are various messages that tell you that they clearly didn't think that their obedience was a bad thing. And a good example of that comes from your handout yet again, and I foolishly do not have notes to myself on this one. Number 19. Herodotus tells us that prior to the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans were getting bad omens. And they realized this was because they had killed sacred ambassadors from the Persians. And they decided they needed to atone for this. They called for volunteers, and two men by the name of Sperthias and Bullus volunteered themselves to sacrifice themselves for the Spartan state. And they went all the way to meet Xerxes, who refused to kill them, and then they went all the way home again. But the interesting thing is, along the way, they met Hydarnes, who was a prominent Persian who would ultimately go on to fight against them at the Battle of Thermopylae. And he told them that they should go over to Xerxes because they would be received as men of honour. And the response of Sperthias and Bayliss was that he was advising them in such a way because he didn't understand the reality of life and he had only experienced slavery. Whereas what they had experienced was freedom. And because they had experienced freedom, they were never going to submit to the Persians. So these are the same Spartans who have the laws as their tyrant. They actually see themselves as free. What we think was the Spartan citizenship oath said that it made Spartans swear that they would not put being alive ahead of being free. As far as they were concerned, they were free. One of the interesting things about Spartan freedom is in debates in the 18th century about how modern Europe should be governed, Sparta was sometimes put forward as a role model because of the notion of freedom. Not because everyone was free, but because the state itself was free. Now, very few people actually sensibly argued that Sparta was a role model, but it was something that people considered. So the Spartans equate their obedience to the laws with actually being free. So the other thing that's worth focusing on at this point in time is the Spartans seem to be a society not just that has a different understanding of the rules compared to the rest of the Greeks, but they also be a society that seems to have set themselves separately from the rest of the Greeks as well. And some of the following images should put that in perspective for you. This is the fertile valley of Messenia, which the Spartans conquered and then enslaved the inhabitants and basically became absentee landlords of the land. This is the mountain range that separates the Spartans from their conquests in Messenia. The Taygetus mountain range is by no means small. Approximately 2,500 metres high at its highest. It's very precipitous. Anyone who's driven over it will know it is not fun, particularly when it's snowing. It effectively cuts the Spartans off from the Messenians, but the Spartans are also quite significantly cut off from the rest of the Peloponnese as well. And I've got a map here to sort of put this in perspective. You have the Spartans here, and you have sort of the urbanish area where you will find the Spartans. You've got the Taygetus mountain range here, there's another mountain range down here, and there's the mountains in Arcadia here are quite impressively difficult to negotiate. So the Spartans are actually quite isolated in terms of where they are in the Greek world. So I sort of think of these mountains as a combination of physical and a metaphorical frontier. The Spartans famously did not have city walls, which makes them quite unusual in the ancient Greek world. And one of the reasons they don't have city walls is they don't really need them because of the combination of military threat that they offer, but also the relative inaccessibility of Sparta. And that's something that actually is highlighted quite nicely in passage, where have we gone? 29, the penultimate passage, where a fellow Peloponnesian is explaining to the Athenians why the Spartans are in a strong position, why they are able to be a military threat to them. And this is at a point where Sparta is no longer a very serious military threat. And he highlights the fact that they are shut off from the sea and that they are able to carry on their training for fighting on land in comparative isolation. So the Spartans are metaphorically isolated from the rest of the Greeks, and they also physically isolate themselves from the rest of the Greeks at various points in time. It's a society which periodically shuts itself off. So Xenophon highlights that. He says he knows that in the past the Spartans expelled foreigners. And this is something that a later lexicographer explains, that the term xenolasia means that the act of not allowing foreigners to intermingle. The Spartans are very happy to make sure that foreigners are not about at various points in time. In Aristophanes' Birds, a society of birds, which is meant to be, often interpreted as a parody of Spartan society, describes itself as like Sparta. Strangers are driven away and blows rain down thick as hail. So there's lots of hitting each other. It's probably not, as a later lexicographer explains, that the Spartans actually drove foreigners away with blows. It's more Sparta kicks out foreigners and there's lots of clubbing of people. And passage, as I've said, passage 29 highlights that Spartan isolation. Another nice passage that highlights Spartan isolation is passage 25, which I've been increasingly having a fondness for since we've entered the world of Brexit. It's a passage that relates to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartans and the Athenians are squabbling about who is responsible for their impending fight. And the Spartans are insisting that the Athenians allow the Megarians, their allies, to use their market and harbours. And the Athenians say, we will do this when the Lacedaemonians suspend their alien acts and in favour of us and our allies and allow us into their markets. So basically there is a debate and a dispute about freedom of movement. And the Spartans are very much on the side of, we don't want people coming in. And the Athenians are saying, well, we'll be more flexible when you're more flexible. And both sides refuse to be more flexible, which I hope is not an analogy for what will happen soon. So what I want to focus on now is what produced this society of xenophobes who were hostile to outsiders and had this cult of obedience. And I look ominously at my watch and see where I'm going here. The central part of what produces the Spartans that we have is the so-called Spartan agōgē, and I have an image here, a map here, which I'm not going to focus on now. The Spartan upbringing. It's called the agōgē. It essentially means the leading. It comes from the verb agō, to lead. It's also the same root of the word agōn, which means competition. As Paul Cartledge points out, it's also where we get the root where we get our word agony from, which matches quite nicely into the Spartan upbringing. Because when you look at the popular images of Spartan upbringing, it is not a fun exercise. Xenophon in the Hellenica has someone say that from the very beginning of boyhood, Spartans are trained and disciplined for land warfare. When you look at some of the passages on the first page of your handout, you'll see some other nice messages about the Spartan upbringing as well. In passage 6, Plutarch describes the upbringing as an austere lifestyle full of hardships, but one designed to train young men to obey orders. For this reason, we are told Simonides applied to Sparta the epithet man-taming, because the effect of her customs was above all to make her citizens obedient to laws like horses which are broken in as young as possible. You can't get a more blunt message than that. If you look at passage 7 from Plato's Laws, you have the Athenian saying to the Spartan Megillus, I want to talk to you about the systematic training in the endurance of pain which is undergone in the community. Sorry, it's not the Athenian speaking, it's the Spartan speaking. I want to talk to you about the systematic training in the endurance of pain which is undergone in our community, consisting of group fights with bare knuckles, and in the process certain acts of theft which take place amid a constant hail of blows. So you've got a strong message about brutality again. And you have a strong message about the fact that this is different from the rest of the Greek world, and that it's very organised in passage 8, where Xenophon, who swallowed the story of Lycurgus whole, the mythical lawgiver of Sparta, says, Lycurgus, in place of private assignment of slave tutors to each boy, stipulated that a man from the group out of which the highest office holders are appointed should take charge of them. He called him the paidonomos. Lycurgus gave this man authority to assemble the boys, to punish them severely when any misbehaved while in his charge. He also gave him a squad of young adults equipped with whips to administer punishments when necessary. The result has been that respect and obedience in combination are to be found in high degree at Sparta. So we have a very strong stereotype here about Spartan upbringing producing obedience, and obedience being brought about through brutality. What I want to do briefly now is follow the latest way of looking at the Spartan upbringing and how we play with our primary sources to give you a few messages that will then allow us to look at this in a different light. In the past, modern scholars would jump straight into Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, which has a very detailed description of the Spartan upbringing, and then just say this is what was going on. But increasingly, we're coming to be very hostile to that idea and very untrusting when it comes to Plutarch. But Xenophon gives very clear messages which are useful. So what I'm going to do is give you Xenophon's story and supplement it with bits from Plutarch that are deemed acceptable. So the first message is what we've just had there. Elsewhere in the Greek world, slaves were tutors to boys, whereas in Sparta there is a state official who oversees that. And Plutarch says the very same thing, that Sparta does not have slaves involved in the education of boys. You have the official who is able to assemble the boys. You have your squad of older youths with whips, and a very strong emphasis on respect and obedience here. Plutarch says in his description of the upbringing, their whole education was aimed at developing smart obedience, perseverance under duress, and victory in battle. The boys are divided into groups. Xenophon uses the term ilai, which means squadrons. Plutarch uses the term agēlai, which means herds. Inscriptions use the term buai, which means something along the lines of herds again. They, according to Xenophon, have no shoes because they're not meant to be too soft. They have one garment, a single cloak. They are furnished with enough food that they will not be sluggish through being too full, so they'll survive, but they're not having too much. They have no baths. Plutarch tells us that they sleep on reed mattresses, which they make themselves. They have to rip the reeds out by hand, which will not be a fun activity. Theft is encouraged so that they can supplement their diet. Xenophon also suggests it will make them better fighters. They're lashed if they're caught stealing, and Xenophon links this to a strange ritual at the shrine of Artemis Orthia involving the stealing of cheeses, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Xenophon has a wonderful line where he says, in the absence of the paidonomos, any citizen could take charge of the boys. And he makes it very clear that they can punish them as they like. Failing that, the smartest of the oldest of boys will take command of the younger boys and oversee their behaviour as well. And he goes on to say, as a result of this, the boys at Sparta are never without someone in charge of them. Plutarch also emphasises that Spartans are taught to speak with great economy. Only necessary words will be delivered. Xenophon and Plutarch both stress the role of pederasty in the Spartan upbringing as well. And Xenophon goes on to say that this is something that doesn't stop. It continues into adulthood. And he makes a very strong contrast to the rest of the Greek world. He says, at a time when boys have developed into youths, elsewhere they are removed from their tutors, they are monitored much more closely in Sparta. He says, in the streets, they have to keep their hands within their cloaks. They proceed in silence. They're not allowed to look about. They have to gaze downwards. And it's all about showing their self-control. There are also some other messages you need to get about the Spartan upbringing. One of them is the importance of music in the Spartan upbringing. An Athenian-based tragedian, Pratinas, described Sparta as like a cicada, eager for a chorus. There is a strong emphasis on reciting the poetry of Tyrtaeus. I knew I'd get to Tyrtaeus in eventually for you. Numbers 15, 16 and 17 are examples of the type of poetry Spartans have to recite and learn. It is a beautiful thing when a good man dies falling in the front ranks. Let us fight with spirit for this land, for our children, no longer sparing our lives. Fight, young men standing close by each other, etc. You've got, come on, youths of Sparta, abounding in good men, sons of citizens' fathers, thrust the shield in your left hands, brandishing your your spear boldly, not sparing your lives, for that is not the ancestral Spartan custom. And we have a saying attributed to the Spartan hero Leonidas, saying when he was asked what sort of poet Tyrtaeus was, he replied that he was a good one to slaughter the lives of young men, because filled up with inspiration by his poems, they were unsparing of themselves in battle. So you have very strong words coming through from Tyrtaeus there, and you have lots of reference to the choral performances of the Spartans, lots of emphasis on practicing, and they have massive choruses by age classes which ultimately reveal themselves at the major religious festivals. Tyrtaeus' poetry is read in some of those contexts. It's also recited on the eve of a major battle and as soldiers march into battle as well. There is a strong emphasis on exercise, and this is something that is even extended to girls. So there's a state education in Sparta for boys and for women as well, and it leads to the rather racy reputation of Spartan women as well. So one of the things that we get when we look at the record is Spartans are prominent when it comes to the Olympic Games. And this is some figures that I've put together based on a graph in Steve Hodkinson's work, just to make it clear, rather than sort of having a black and white image. The red line represents Spartan athletic victories at the Olympics. The blue line represents Spartan equestrian victories at the Olympics. And the interesting thing about it is this section here, this big spike, this whole area of a spike here, is in this era, the Spartans represent 68% of the known gymnastic victors at the Olympic Games. So they're good at gymnastics. And then, intriguingly, they pretty much stop around the middle of the 6th century, and they plummet to representing 30% of the known victors. This is often interpreted as the Spartans have been very good at it, everyone else has caught up. But I'm wondering whether what this actually represents is the Spartans are no longer participating near as much as they used to. Intriguingly, there is no evidence of Spartans ever winning at the Nemean, Pythian or Isthmian Games. They are only attested at winning at the Olympics. And it's odd that they're not represented as winning at the others, and no recent studies have suggested anything other than they just don't go to those other games. And I'm wondering whether the Spartans are actually stopping going to the Olympics as well, which would work with a spike in equestrian victories, because you don't actually have to go to the Olympic Games to win in the equestrian events, because you don't actually have to drive the chariots yourself, someone else does. And the best example of that is the fabulous story of Philip of Macedon learning on the same day that Alexander the Great was born, he'd won a major battle and he'd won at the Olympics. He just got the news, you've won at the Olympics today. So the Spartans don't actually need to go there. So this could be a sign of their relative isolation. But I am going to need to rush through a few things. So another part of the Spartan upbringing is various rites of passage associated with the goddess Artemis Orthia. There is the wonderful ritual of the stealing of votive cheeses, which gets turned into a later Roman tourist event, and Cicero and Plutarch both say that they saw boys die under the lash at the shrine of Artemis Orthia, and you can see the remains of the complex there. There is also something going on with a series of grotesque masks, which have been found in the context of the shrine as well. And another key part of the Spartan upbringing is the so-called crypteia, which is mentioned in passages 13 and 14 on your handout. Boys, we don't know whether it's some or all boys, are sent out into the countryside armed with a dagger, and their job appears to have been to eliminate helots who seem big and threatening, or report helots who seem big and threatening, who will be removed later on. Paul Cartledge compares it to sort of the training that special forces get in the military, that they have to go out and live at large with not much equipment and lie low until they can do what they need to do. And as I've already emphasised, this continues into adulthood. Age 20, you become a citizen, but you're not suddenly free at the point you're a citizen. You have to dine in common messes with your fellow citizens. There are no exceptions to this. Even the kings have to participate in the common messes. And one of my favourite stories is after the major victory of the Spartans in 418 BC at the Battle of Mantinea, the Spartan king Agōgē, who had led the Spartans to victory, asked to eat at home rather than in the messes. He was told he had to eat with his fellow citizens. He did so under sufferance, and the next day refused to make a sacrifice as a show of defiance, and then was given a fine for not having followed the rules. There is an element of communal living for young adults as well. All Spartans up to age 30, or just the elite unit of the 300 hippes, depending on modern interpretations, have to live in barracks. And there is a strong emphasis on the lifestyle as being austere, frugal, not drinking very much, as you can see from the passage on the slide here. So, the point of what I'm trying to make in this talk today is, at some point in time, the Spartans chose to do this. Their society evolved into this society that I'm describing here. And what I want to think about is what might have motivated them to do this. And the answer to me lies in sociology and psychology. And there have been some recent examples where modern scholars have used sociology and psychology to try and understand aspects of Sparta. In a recent study, Paul Christensen employs weak structuralism to the role of sport in Spartan society and look at the way it shapes the behaviour of men and women and the knock-on effect that actually has in enforcing Spartan rules. William Blake Tyrrell has compared Sparta to a modern charismatic cult, with the problem that they don't actually have a cult leader and they have to invent the cult leader afterwards to make it work. You've had a study by Ellen Millender, published extremely recently in the last year, which has looked at Sparta's treatments of the Helots and compared it to state-sponsored terrorism. And there have been a variety of studies which have looked at examples of Spartans behaving slightly oddly, which have been attributing them to their behaviour to post-traumatic stress disorder, which has been linked to Spartans having too much involvement in warfare. All of these studies have their strengths and weaknesses. One of the key weaknesses they have in common is they either describe only the rules as they apply to the Spartan citizens themselves, or their focus on what the Helots are doing. So Christensen's example doesn't look at the Helots at all and just looks at the inculcation of Spartan values to Spartans themselves and focuses very narrowly on sport. Whereas Millender is very much focusing on the terrorising of the Helots and overlooking the fact that the Spartan citizens terrorise their own just as much as they terrorise the Spartans. And people who've been looking at post-traumatic stress disorder don't really manage to explain why Spartans, who are not fighting any more than other Greeks, are suddenly being more obviously psychologically scarred than other Greeks. The Spartans, who are notoriously slow to go to war, shouldn't be fighting more than anyone else. And in one of the major studies focusing on a Spartan by the name of Clearchus, one of the problems the author himself recognises is that it's very hard to work out what the battles he was involved in were that led to him being psychologically scarred. And lastly, William Blake Tyrrell's study comparing Sparta to a charismatic cult, he openly admits one of the problems he has is trying to incorporate what he calls the outsiders, i.e. the Helots and the Perioikoi, into his cult model. It only allows you to explain the Spartans' citizens themselves. But despite the flaws, together they pinpoint key issues. Firstly, the Spartans developed and enforced a set of rules that applied not just to themselves, but to their subject peoples. Secondly, the frequent terrorization of youths, both boys and Helots, was part of the Spartan system and part of the imposition, enforcement, and monitoring of Spartan rules. And thirdly, psychological pressure via secrecy, punishment, violence was part and parcel of Spartan life. So what I want to look at very quickly is some actual sort of parts of these arguments that I've been discussing here. And I'm going to focus particularly now on the arguments of Paul Christensen and William Blake Tyrrell, both focusing on the Spartiate end of things. Christensen sees sport as crucial in the process of what he calls coercion and indoctrination. And Tyrrell sees the Spartan cult developing in a process whereby cult leaders impose, and I quote here, a routine that prescribes when and what to eat, when to sleep, what clothes to wear, the rituals to perform, and the tasks, usually repetitive and time-consuming, to be carried out. These processes, in both cases, bear strong resemblance to what sociologists call organisational socialisation, a process typically associated with so-called total institutions. In his archetypal study of the total institution, Irving Goffman defined a total institution as a place of residence and work where a large number of like-situated individuals, cut off from the wider society for an appreciable period of time, together lead an enclosed, formally administered round of life. Such institutions are characterised by a breakdown of barriers separating sleep, work and recreation, disruption of freedom of action, large batches of people in the same place following the same set of rules, the performance of collective removal activities, as they're called, tightly scheduled running of this by a small group of officials, inmates are moved where the system remains as it is, and obedience is key. I have a quote from an inmate, for want of a better term, of a nunnery. This is another of the marvels of living in obedience. No one is ever doing anything more important than you are if you are obeying. And the same sort of rules appear to apply in Sparta. Other key factors of a total institution, there are barriers to the outside world, and these can be not just physical but also metaphorical. And a key feature is a lack of an off-stage area, what Goffman describes as a place of solace that you can crawl into. There is no switching off in a total institution. And there are various different types of total institutions. Goffman's iconic study was focused on a 1950s mental asylum. But when we think about Tyrrell's argument, it's worth bearing in mind that cults are a form of total institution as well. The most obvious and relevant types to this study are those which Goffman characterised as established purportedly to better pursue the work-like task and justify some work-like task and justifying themselves only on these instrumental grounds. And by these he meant army barracks, boarding schools, ships, work camps and servants' quarters. And there are obvious analogies here. In his 1970s study of total institutions called Squaddy's Portrait of a Subculture, John Hockey identified the key elements of the self that total institutions erode: self-determination, autonomy of movement, privacy, and personal appearance. And these are exactly what Tyrrell identifies as signs of his Spartan cult. They are exactly the things he mentioned earlier. In recent years, Goffman's model has been somewhat supplanted, partly because total institutions have evolved. His work actually exposed the horrors of the mid-20th century asylum and forced changes to be made. The modern military is no longer able to use corporal punishment in the way that it once did, and the same thing happens in boarding schools as well. Total institutions these days are increasingly seen as relatively voluntaristic, which has led to the development of the idea of the reinventive institution. An institution where there's mutual surveillance rather than a big brother watching kind of way of doing things. They're also known as greedy institutions, and one of the things sociologists focus on is the fact that they demand total loyalty from the members. There is rarely a physical confine in such reinventive institutions. They have much more symbolic boundaries, but sociologists recognise they can be just as restrictive and dangerous as the old-style total institution as well. And the example that I was reading about most recently was modern dance schools, where the members of the dance school monitor each other's behaviour in a positive and a negative way, to the point where they end up celebrating their injuries as a badge of honour and their commitment to the institution that they are part of. And they spend longer and longer hours in the institution rather than actually trying to leave it, which is technically allowed to them. And that's useful for thinking about when we consider how and when the Spartans developed their unique society. And one of the things I'm pondering here is, did they effectively choose to set themselves up that way and then degenerate into what Goffman would have recognised as a total institution proper? And if I have time, and I think I have time, I just want to give a few examples of where Sparta might actually look like a total institution so that we can actually sort of reflect on this a bit more. Sparta actually has a lot of aspects to its society that look like a total institution. There's the fearsome focus on obedience to the rules and the need to be seen to follow them. Boys not getting caught is part of the key message we get from our primary sources, and the almost entirely apocryphal story but very famous example of the Spartan boy who stole a fox was going to be caught with the fox, hid it under his cloak to protect his fellow Spartan boys, and allowed the fox to claw him to death rather than admit that he had been stealing. Men are not meant to be caught entering the quarters of their wives. You're not meant to be seen breaking the rules, is something that's very obviously part of Spartan society, and it's something that is typical of a total institution. There is also a strong emphasis in the Spartan society of what sociologists call removal activities, the gymnastic exercises, the brutal ball games, the choral singing, the dancing, the marching that takes place in Sparta, the singing of songs while marching that resembles marching cadences used in the modern military. The strong emphasis on hunting as well that is part of Spartan society. You have a Spartan wine cup with a hunting scene on that. It's not just a removal activity, it's also something that the modern military would recognise as well. It is something that is conditioning Spartans to killing, something that psychologists refer to as conditioning you to tolerate the gore. And we have the gore in this image here. You have the blood streaking down the wounded animals there. One of the things that the modern military has worked out is people don't like killing other people. Funny that. They need to be conditioned to do it. Target practice needs to actually have human-like shapes. Otherwise, people won't actually want to kill other people. And evidence from important battlefields suggests that people are very scared about killing other people. I can talk about that in questions if we have time later on. There is a strong use of uniforms in Sparta. They wear their red cloaks. They have their long hair. Boys are issued with a sickle, and they will dedicate their sickle after they sort of graduate into adulthood. The uniforms do not just apply to the Spartans themselves. The helots are dressed in skins. This is often associated with making them seem more animal-like, but the wording to describe the skins that the helots wear is actually just sort of leather. It's the type of dress you associate with servile workers elsewhere in the Greek world. So the helots are sort of the workers. The Spartans have the uniform of the soldiers. Punishment for failure. If you are a coward in Sparta, you don't get to look like a Spartan. You have to shave off half of your beard so you look ridiculous. You don't get to wear the red cloak after all. This is a photo of a mugshot from an American website. I don't know why the man in question decided to make himself look like that. There's a period of mortification, as you would find in a total institution. The boys have their heads shaved. There's a strong focus on dirtiness. They're not allowed to bathe. And this is something that is recognisable in the worst type of total institution. There is a strong emphasis on corporal punishment. Those of you who know anything about punishments in the military, they like to punish people by making them hold up rifles. The Spartans have a punishment where you have to hold up the huge wooden bronze-faced shield. It's exactly the same type of punishment. They have to rip the reeds out of the reed bed to make their beds. In some concentration camps, the beds were made out of straw, and the victims had to align their beds every day as part of the ritual. The physical removal of Spartans from the rest of society, the barracks life of the teenage boys and the barracks life of some of the adults. a period of liminality as they progress from one phase of their education to the next. These are things we associate with total institutions as well. The careful management of what the outside world gets to see as well is something that is very much associated with total institutions as well. Goffman makes a lot of the fact that in time of religious festivals, total institutions will allow a moment of plenty. And there is also a very clear difference between what the institution is like and what outsiders get to see. The visitor's room does not look anything like what the room of an inmate will actually be like. Visitors are never exposed to the worst of the total institution. At Sparta, the obvious time that visitors are actually allowed in is festivals. It is a time when we know Sparta doesn't look anything like what it does at the rest of the time, and one of the obvious examples of difference at the time of festivals in Sparta is the food, which is much more opulent, much more enjoyable fare than they have at the rest of the time. And the other thing that you associate with total institutions as well is what sociologists call secondary adjustments, ways of dodging the system. And theft, the message about theft that we get in Sparta is very obvious. It comes in a variety of sources, and theft is something that is very much part and parcel of modern military life. You're just not meant to get caught. In basic training, it is quite common for people to find objects that they're going to need, spare pairs of boots, extra shirts that will be in pristine condition. As long as no one is caught finding them, it's absolutely fine. Equipment will also be stockpiled as well. Non-commissioned officers will know about it, but the officers won't. And if the officers do find out about it, everyone is punished quite severely. But as long as you're not caught, you will get away with it. It's exactly the same kind of rules that are going on in Sparta. And if I may be allowed 2 extra minutes, I'd just like to finish on thinking about what the psychological and physiological impact of all of this might be. In Sparta, one of the things that comes out of all of their way in which their society works is a message about cohesion. A society that is thinking the same and acting the same. And the obvious example of that comes out in coordinated movement. The marching of the Spartans into battle is something that other Greeks admire. Where other Greeks will be known to run headlong into battle, the Spartans march slowly and synchronized into battle. It's a kind of process that is known today as entrainment. Violence is also something that might be coming out in the Spartan society as well. Cultural spillover theory suggests that a society which has violent activities, such as the brutal ball games the Spartans play or the brutal activities in the gymnasium, might generate more violence in a society, and violence within it and outside it as well. And if you want to see examples of Spartans being violent, passages 27 and 28. You have a Spartan governor in charge of the garrison in the recently conquered Athens. The Spartan commander can't resist hitting an Athenian over the head with his staff. Spartans are very good at beating other people up with their sticks. It's what they seem to do. Passage 28 is an example of the type of behaviour that happens when Spartans get out of their society as well. Pausanias, the victor at the Battle of Plataea, is known for his violent behaviour to non-Spartans once he's out and about. You've also got this potential death cult developing in Sparta as well, where the poetry of Tyrtaeus is killing young men. And there's a preponderance of leaders who go off and fight to the death, losing battles because they're more interested in actually fighting to the death and following the Spartan way than actually trying to win. You also see Spartans struggling with the outside world. Pausanias in passage 28, you have a strong message about Spartans becoming greedy, and this is something that maps onto what sociologists tell us about total institutions. When people are released from a total institution, they either forget what things were like and actually start to adapt too well to the outside world, or they over-remember how awful it was and then try and make up for it even more so. There is also a strong message in our primary sources of Spartans being angry. I'm compiling a catalogue of Spartan behaviours and emotions, and one that comes out again and again is anger. Spartans are very angry. They fly off the handle at the drop of a hat. They are also fearful. A very interesting work from the 1930s catalogued all the examples of Spartans being fearful. It suggested that this was a national defect in Sparta. They were actually a naturally fearful people. I don't think that's what's going on here, but I think the brutality of the Spartan upbringing is producing people who have somewhat a psychologically damaged perspective. And that brings me back to the suggestion that the Spartans might have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Rather than seeing the Spartans suffering PTSD as a result of too much battle, I wonder whether what's actually going on in Sparta is their upbringing is so brutal that it's actually creating problems for them. And I'm going to end by directing your attention to passage 30, which is Plutarch's description of what happened to Pausanias, the Spartan who's already been being violent to other people. He decided he wanted a girl. His purpose was to disgrace her. He insisted that she was brought to his quarters. She came in when he was not expecting it. She accidentally knocked over the light. In blind panic, he stabbed her. And the wording, as Plutarch puts it here, is, I can't remember where we've lost it here, I meant to have it here, but he was fearing violence. Having killed the girl, he's then plagued by nightmares of her when she comes to see him and harass him, and he ends up having a very unhappy experience. He goes to a oracle of the dead to try and assuage sort of his fears about this and try and get sort of end the pollution, and then she ends up prophesying that he will die the hideous death that he ends up suffering. Pausanias here bears many of the textbook symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. He is hypervigilant. He is expecting disaster at all occasions. He is plagued by bad dreams from his events, so from the events of his life. So I'm wondering whether this is a symptom of potentially Spartans being psychologically damaged by all of this emphasis on the need to be obedient. And true to form, I've finished 5 minutes over, which none of my students in the room would be surprised by, and that's where I'll have to end it.